So you guys are doing a Tanakh class now, right? Is that what's going on, or is it just Nach?
Nah.
Nach.
Yeah.
Okay. I had a feeling.
Yeah.
You get enough tea in the Reformed synagogue.
Yeah.
You get way too much tea in the Reformed synagogue. Because in a way, this is a line that I like to say is that Judaism has very little to do with Torah as we practice it today. And it is really true. It's such an ancient document, and all you have to do is who this morning sacrificed an animal to Yahweh, right? And so there's some very 20% of the Bible is probably talking about animal sacrifice. I'm making sort of a rough guess. We tend to sort of gloss over how distant the Torah is from the Judaism that we practice today, and that's I think also very much true of Nach. It's really distant from what we do, but we also don't really read Nach in the Reformed synagogue that much. So it's a great place for adult study because there are some really good pockets of literature within Nach. As far as whole books, there's probably not a whole lot that you can sit down and read the whole book and have a good reading experience as a modern reader. I think probably the only two would be Song of Songs, which we're going to be doing today, which travels pretty well over time, and probably Ecclesiastes also travels well over time because it's so incredibly world weary, and we live in a post-existentialist world and are somewhat world weary in our approach. And then there's other little pockets and stories in Nach that I think are pretty good. Psalms would probably be another good example, right? Because that's edifying, right? Psalms are good when you're down as a pick-me-up, so they carry pretty well over time. But Nach itself is tough. All you have to do is sort of, I guess, dig into Judges or something like that, and you realize pretty quickly that this doesn't necessarily travel that well. But I thought that I requested Song of Songs and was pleasantly surprised that I actually got it because I thought for sure that somebody else would get it before me. Was there a fight at all for Song of Songs?
I remember you were an early respondent. So
well, that's why I dug right in. I was like, the only way I'm going to get Song of Songs is if I respond right away. Yeah. So I went right in and I got it. That and Ecclesiastes are the two most desirable to teach because they travel so well. So what I thought we'd do in this first lesson, mostly what we're going to be talking about is what exactly this piece of literature is. And along the way you get a number of other questions. Pardon my French. The main one is, how the hell did this get in the Bible? Right? Which is the most obvious question, I think, once we read some of it. And what did the rabbis do with it in order to get it in the Bible? Right? In other words, to keep it canonized. So we'll go over some of the major ways that the text has been interpreted over time, and then I have a rabbinic midrash that we can do towards the end. I don't know if we're here for an hour and a half, am I right? Which I don't think we're going to go the full hour and a half. I'll say right off the bat. We'll see how it goes. I've said that before at the beginning when I taught you guys, and then it did go that long, which always sort of surprises me. Our confirmation class sessions are an hour and a half, which I think is horrible torture to do to teenagers. I couldn't sit for an hour and a half when I was 15, right? And that was quite a while ago. And their attention spans are even shorter. I always just cut it off at an hour when I teach them. I think we'll go a little longer today. But what I thought that we'd do is we'd start in the midst, so to speak, is that we would start with the actual text, and we're not going to start at the beginning. This is one really wonderful part about the Bible, which the rabbis saw right away, is you don't really have to start at the beginning in order to get a lot out of it. I think that's true of most ancient literature. when you're reading the Iliad or the Odyssey, you can just sort of dig right into one little section of it, and it works perfectly fine. That's a lot of how ancient literature worked, and the Bible is the same way. So I want to start with chapter 4 rather than with chapter 1. Why did I pick chapter 4? Well, I guess I should give a little bit of an introduction about how this book works. There are really three major literary voices in Song of Songs. There is the voice of the man speaking to the woman, the voice of the woman speaking to the man, and then occasionally there's what we would call a chorus.
Oh, yeah?
Right? As far as ancient Mediterranean literature, right? We know about this term, the chorus, from ancient Greek literature, right? In ancient Greek theater, occasionally a group of people would come out and would do recitation and or singing. And it's sort of commentary on what's going on in the narrative, right? The chorus comes in, and Song of Songs, being ancient Mediterranean literature, also has something which I think is very fair to call a chorus. Occasionally, a voice comes in that's sort of an outside voice from the dialogue between the man and the woman. And thinking of that as in the same sort of context as an ancient Greek chorus is a good way to think about that. So when the first person narrative, when the first person voices go away, that's what's going on. I picked a section where the man is speaking to the woman here in chapter 4. And I picked this particular chapter because it's the most sexual chapter. All right? This is an incredibly sexual poem that a lot of translators have tried to hide the sexuality from the reader to various degrees. I think it's pretty impossible not to sort of hide it, right? Because, I guess that there have been some recent translations that really sort of go for it, so to speak, with the translation. But the ones that end up in the Bible always tend to soften that a little bit, all right? So let's just let's just read chapter 4. And, all right, so here we have this young man courting this young woman. She's probably like, 13 or 14 if she's being courted. We have to remember this is the ancient world. Once women were able essentially to procreate, they were marriageable, and marriage would come soon after. So she's probably a really young teenager. She's probably being courted by an older man, as usually happened in that world. She's probably being courted by someone who's somewhere in the range of early 20s to early 40s. The lifespan of a man was about 40 at the time, so if you made it to your early 40s, you were doing pretty well, in sort of average lifespan. So she was probably being courted. My guess on this one is probably a guy in his early 20s. But the way courtship happened then was really different in the ancient Mediterranean world. Very young women and older men, and that was completely normal. Not that it's sort of not normal in our society. I had two different friends from high school who over the past 2 or 3 years have gotten a divorce and have gotten involved with women half their age. This happens all the time. So you sort of have these shocked looks on your face. This is what men do in this world when they get divorced. For whatever reason it seems. So this is a very common thing. It's, I guess, less shocking in this world. So, and again, less shocking again. I see it all the time. I had a joke I lived in Palo Alto for a while. I got this PhD at Stanford, and my kid was in daycare at the JCC, and I used to say that I was the youngest dad and my wife was the oldest mom. And it was pretty much true, because when we got into Palo Alto, it was a lot of very successful men who were doing the second marriage, and all of a sudden, we're sort of in their 50s or 60s with a 4-year-old, and with the wife half their age. I guess this is less common around here. It was very common in California. So, in any So let's read this. Let's read this poem from the Song of Songs. Why don't I have someone read the first 8 verses?
Ah, you are fair, my darling. Ah, you are fair. Your eyes are like doves behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes climbing up from the washing sea.
All right, we have to stop because everybody's giggling right away.
What
The ancient idea.
1409.
Okay,
1409.
1731, chapter 4, 1731.
No, which book do you have?
Chapter 4 of Song of Songs. If you're in the brown book, it's 1731.
And what about the green?
I can't help you with that one.
1409. 1409.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody immediately started laughing a little bit. You know, it's interesting. I mean, there are in any sort of poetry, there are always stock poetic images, right? You know, that are used. I'm trying to think what would be a stock romantic poetic image. Let's go to like Rod McEwen, right? You know, sort of like cheesy poetry of the 60s or 70s. Your eyes are like stars in the sky. Okay, you have these sort of stock, you know, sort of imagery that's used. This stock imagery, this cliched imagery, changes over time, right? So the stock imagery of the ancient Mediterranean world is very different than our stock imagery. So it doesn't translate that well, right? And I'm not talking about from Hebrew to English, but it doesn't translate culturally that well. So when we read these images, these are, you know, sort of, all stock imagery is generally doing is taking sort of images from the world around us and using them as sort of archetypical images of beauty, right? Well, it's going to be a little different when you're a sheep herder in the ancient world than when, you know, you're living in our, you know, post-industrial society, right? So lots of this animal imagery. You know, if you're a goat herder, there are beautiful goats, right? Right. I mean, you love your goats.
From what?
Yeah, at Asarui, there's a goat named Steve. I'm very fond of Steve. I'm very happy to go back to Asarui every year and say hello to Steve. I mean, it's a different relationship than this. We have to, I guess, you know, sort of open our minds to this different stock imagery. All right, so whoever was reading, let's continue on verse 2. Or read verse 2 again and then keep going.
Verse 2?
Your teeth, the teeth,
Yeah, starting with the teeth.
your teeth are like a flock of ewes climbing up from the washing pool.
All of them bear twins, and not one loses her young. Your lips are like the crimson thread. Your mouth is lovely. Your brow behind your veil gleams like a pomegranate split open. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built to hold weapons, hung with 1,000 shields, all the quivers of warriors. Your breasts are like 2 fawns, twins of a gazelle, browsing among the lilies. When the day blows gently and the shadows flee, I will take me to the mount of mirth, to the hill of frankincense.
All right. This is a sexual image. Verse 6. All right? We are talking about the mountain of myrrh and hill of frankincense. We are talking about female sexual organs. Okay? All right? This is, you know, again, in the translation, we have to have a bit of a euphemism going on here. Again, it's lost in the stock imagery, but I felt like we had to just stop right there. All right, so keep on going. So as he's going from head to toe here. All right, so we started right here with the face. We're going down to the breasts, and then he keeps on going. All right? All right, so let's continue with verse 6.
Every part of you is fair, my darling. There is no blemish in you. From Lebanon, come with me. From Lebanon, my bride with me. Trip down from Amana's peak, from the peak of Senir and Hermon, from the lens of lions, from the hills of leopards.
Okay. Why don't we just stop right there? Yeah, so we get this wonderful, there's another parallel, and I forget where it is. I could have brought that one in and we could have compared the two. There's another one where she's speaking about his body, and she also does a head-to-toe description of him. All right, so that's what we're doing here, is we're getting this image of her beauty, all right, from the head to the toe. So we start with the eyes, and of course she's her face is covered like any woman's face would be covered when they're in public in the Middle East, in the Near East. Then we get her hair, because that would be flowing lower than her eyes, right? It's like a flock of goats moving. It's just, yeah. The teeth, right? If you have white teeth, you're doing pretty good. Think of like sort of like pictures of British people in the 1950s, okay? Socialized medicine, right? You don't end up having as great a teeth as we do, right? So it wasn't this type of dental care that we have in our present day world. Then her lips, then her cheeks, again behind her veil, her neck. It's interesting, we have this image of strength in the neck. A woman being strong would be beautiful. Because you're not only marrying a woman, you're marrying a workhorse. No, I mean really, right? So the images of beauty, are going to be a little bit different, right? Another stock image of beauty in medieval poetry is a woman who has, her upper arms are big.
Biceps.
Right? She has big biceps. Because that's not that common with a woman. And that's really helpful to have a wife who's got big biceps, right? There's work to be done. So that's, there's different images of beauty. Strength is much more a part of it than sort of our, sort of Vogue model image of beauty today, right? So these women, they're Mediterranean women. To use the Yiddish, they're starkas, right? I mean, these are sturdy women, right? That's how most Mediterranean women are built, right? So, I love that. That doesn't translate well. You'd never say in a modern poetry today, yeah, you're a big-necked woman, right? Although if you listen to soul music at all, black people get it, because that's really sexy in black culture, right? To be sturdy, to use a polite term, right?
The idea about the veil, is it covered from the head down, then, rather than people?
I don't know, but really your whole face would be covered, really, right? I mean, that's just a part of a woman going out in public in the ancient Mediterranean world, would be a covered face. I mean, we have to also realize, in the ancient Mediterranean world, a woman being out is strange, without men, and dangerous, right? I think we'll do that scene later on. There's a scene where she experiences the repercussions of going out alone as a woman, as she sneaks out to meet the man, right? Women were inside, and they would really generally only go out with men. So you'd be out with your brothers or your father, and then when you got married, you'd be out with your sons and your husband. But other than that, you'd be inside. So, and if you go outside, then women are always kept from view, right? So even when you go out, you're kept from view. That runs through the medieval period in the Mediterranean. I mean, we don't realize how strange it is that here there's all these women sitting here, and you're outside of your house, and your faces aren't covered. You're showing your hair and things like this. It's totally bizarre as far as the vast history of humanity, right? So obviously more battles have been won, and there's more battles still to be won for women, but that's how stark it was in the ancient world, okay? So yeah, it's mentioned not once but twice that she's veiled, right? All right, let me keep on going. Down, her breasts are like fawns. Lots of fawn imagery. This gets picked up in has anybody read any of the medieval Spanish poetry by Yehuda Halevi and all those guys? Every 10 seconds, their breasts like fawns in that Jewish medieval poetry. This image gets picked. A lot of the image from Song of Songs has a second life in medieval Spain in that Jewish poetry. All right. Then we have the Mountain of Myrrh. Essentially, we're talking about pubic hair here, and apparently fragrant pubic hair as well, because it's myrrh and frankincense, right? And then, yeah, she's beautiful, she's perfect. So he's like, come on, let's go on vacation in the north. Let's go up to the mountains, into the forest of Lebanon, right? So we're talking about Mount Hermon up in the north, right, in Lebanon, which at the time would have been, gorgeous cedar forests, which have been totally decimated by thousands of years of warfare in the region. No more cedar forests in Lebanon, right, as the war continues to this day, right? But in the ancient world, there were these gorgeous forests up there. So he's essentially, come away with me, is what he's saying here. And he's saying, I'm trying to think of what an equivalent is. Lebanon is a metaphor of beauty, right? It's a bit like where I'm moving, right? Come away to Park City. That's why there's those TV ads that are on right now, right? You vacation in the mountains, right? Especially if you live in the desert, right? There's good air and it's nice and cool in the summer, etc., right? So come away with me, all right, up to the mountains in the north in Lebanon. All right. So any other comments or just general observations about this poem so far? I want to keep on going a little bit more, because then he starts talking more about his love. But
He doesn't comment on her intelligence.
no, we have a writer here, so this is totally hypothetical, right? There's no mention of anything but her body.
Right.
Would be another way to put it, right? Although we do have some glimmers at certain points in the poem of her character, so we'll get there. She has character and she has a strength to her, and that's attractive to him, right? But in this, no, this is just body. You're absolutely right.
Rabbi, her description in this, just on the next page.
Right.
Chapter 5, verse 10,
Mhm.
top of the 17th
Okay.
paragraph. My beloved is clear-skinned and ruddy, his lips are like lilacs, his hands are rods of gold.
I have to go get my Bible. Okay, let me read it, because I just brought 4 in. Go ahead.
You want me to read the whole thing?
No, it's all right. We don't need to do it. We don't need to do it. But
He's majestic as Lebanon.
Yeah, so we're going to have, very similar imagery. I mean, there's going to be some difference there. The sort of like stereotypical stock imagery. We're not going to comment on his breasts, right? And it's also a male who's writing this, so we're probably not going to have comment about his sexual organs either, right? So we have a heterosexual male who's writing this, so that's going to be glossed over. But it's a very similar sort of top-down description that happens there.
Belly's a tablet of ivory, his legs are like marble pillars.
Yeah, his strength, right? He's going to be this sort of, and it's interesting how.
It's like the poster in the gym.
Yeah, it's like the poster in the gym, but it's also interesting that whiteness is beauty, right? Which would be odd in their culture, right? Of dark folks. These are Mediterranean folks. They don't look like us. Our Jewish blood spent all this time in Eastern Europe, and we're all, we've been whitified through the process, right? Have not been in the sun enough for the past, 1,000 years or so. But these were dark and ruddy people. But he, ultimately it says at the beginning, he is dark and ruddy, right? So there's this image of Semitic strength at the beginning. But when we go to the stock imagery that's at his disposal glorifies whiteness, which is sort of interesting, right? So the marble pillars. And it's architectural imagery as well. A man should be like a building, a strong building.
Is he married at this time? It says, from Lebanon, my bride with me.
Oh, he's just calling her his bride.
Okay,
It's
they
supposed
haven't
to be
consummated.
evocative, right? They have not consummated, right? But that's a very evocative thing to say, my bride. Because there's sexual intimation about that, right? Because that's when you have sex, is once you're married. So by saying my bride, there's a sexual illusion there. It's like saying I want to have sex with you by calling her the bride. It's an evocative moment, right? Obviously, there was premarital sex in the ancient world as well. I mean, humans are humans, so But as far as the cultural norm was that there wasn't premarital sex, right? And there would be social repercussions for the woman if she was caught,
Oh, yeah.
right? If she's not caught, fine. So that's what's so, sort of playful about this courtship between the two of them, is that there is sexuality going on before marriage, but it's illicit, right? Makes it more fun if it's illicit, right? But there's, she has to not ultimately, them not getting caught is important, right? Because there are real repercussions, and we know that sort of from the biblical laws, right? She ultimately loses value as far as the money that's sort of transferred in the transfer of responsibility from her father to her husband. She's damaged goods, so to speak, right? So that's sort of in the background, is that this whole thing is illicit, but probably I would imagine very common, right? I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that it. How could I put it? Sexuality happens. Humans are mammals, so. All right. Any other comments, questions? Mm-hmm.
I thought that was the act of marriage, was just consummating your relationship.
Yeah, by rabbinic law, yeah, but the rabbis don't like that fact. And, ultimately, the consummation is an act of marriage, but there's right of refusal, right? So ultimately, the woman can refuse, right? So, there's all kinds of horrible things that come out of this, because rape can essentially consummate marriage. Right? That'd be one way to take a bride, would be rape. But if the bride decides no, then as far as the marriage, post facto, then she wouldn't have to marry a rapist. So that's, a vast improvement in the law, right? But yeah, sex that would constitute the possibility of marriage. But her and her family get rights of refusal, which probably is literally in response to rape as a way of taking a bride. Right? The ancient world's a rough place. It's a rough place. So this is very much in contrast to that. This is romance, right? But yes, technically sexuality can constitute marriage. The rabbis are very down on that. Once we get to the Talmud, they don't. They want a ketubah. Is what it gets down to. They want a ketubah to happen, although it constitutes marriage. Ein b'yashniya b'beit aviyah. That was like the rabbinic joke about that, because it rhymes. Did you hear the rhyme in that? It's that if you have sex with a woman, you're not allowed to have sex with her again until the marriage night. Right? That was ultimately what the rabbis ruled. Just because you broke the rule doesn't mean that you get to marry her. There's a marriage coming, and you can't have sex with her again until you have that marriage. That's ultimately how what the rabbis do. So let's keep going. Let's read a little bit with verse 9 here, and let's continue. So you've ravaged my heart, my sister, my bride. It's interesting that sister is a romantic term of endearment, right? But it is. You have ravaged my heart with the glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. How sweet is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. There's really a lot about smell in this, right? And people smell, right? Much more than we do now. And so probably the way that they thought about people smelling is different than the way that we think about people smelling, right? Again, black culture does this better. The word funk means body smell. It's good to have the funk in black culture, right? So it's there's elements of this retained in some contemporary cultures. But body smell was attractive. Humans should smell. They should stink. And you like this, you like the stink of your mate. Right? The stink of your mate is a pleasant thing as opposed to maybe the stink of other humans. Right? It's something very sort of different than the way that we think about romance now. We try so hard to not smell. Right? All the more in America than even in Europe, right? I feel confident, I'm not going to do it with a show of hands, but I feel confident that almost everybody has bathed in the past 24 hours. Right? I feel very confident of that in an American room. If we were in France, I wouldn't be as confident, right? We have sort of a different concept of these things, right? But all the more so in the ancient world, right? Especially in a place where water is a commodity, right? One generally would bathe not through water. Why? It's a dry climate. You don't put water on it, it dries you out more. You bathe by putting oil on yourself. If you're wealthy, you rub yourself down with olive oil. Now that's not going to help how you smell, right? But your skin's going to be smooth and not dry, right? It's a very, very different one. So all of this smell imagery is a big piece of romance, and we've totally lost that in our culture, right? You know, can you see that on a first date? You stink. Big smile on your face. How that one would have gone over, right? No, I don't think so, right? All right. But here he's like, yeah, the fragrance of your oils, right? You mean your sweat smells nice, right?
Well, just as an aside, they were talking on TV the other day, I guess Delta Airlines has created a scent that will identify when you're on Delta Airlines.
Wow.
Really?
Wow.
I don't know.
No, there's...
We're in the Brown book, the JPS. Are
Right.
you in a different book?
Yeah, I have a slightly
Because
different translation.
okay.
I'm using the NRSV. You guys have the JPS.
Okay, but the
I only
interesting,
said my sister.
here it says you have captured my heart. Yours, what did yours say?
In which verse? Ravaged.
Okay, there's a difference between capture
Right.
and ravage.
Right.
Now, this one says my own, my bride.
Look, this is poetry.
Right,
So
but how does the Hebrew indicate how?
I don't have the Hebrew with me. So this is poetry. So ultimately, there's going to be a big range in translation.
I just wondered what, maybe Phyllis or somebody, what's the word for bride?
Yeah,
For
yeah.
my own.
Do you
What's
have
word
the
for sister?
The block? Okay, yeah. That's the. I mean, I think the block is probably the best translation. And there are a lot of words in this that are very difficult, which is generally true of poetry, where you have these apex legomena, these words that only appear once in the Bible. So if a word only appears once, we don't have any idea what it means, right? Because you learn from context. So we only have this one context. So there's a huge possibility as far as semantic range and translation. And so what often scholars then do is they go to other Semitic languages looking for cognates, and that's what Block does. But Block's also working with, what's her name? Who's this partner in crime? Hannah Block, right. Yeah, she's a poet. So that's why this is such a good translation, is he's a Semiticist and she's a poet.
There's an explanation of when they use
Of
the
that
words.
word?
Yeah.
No, that translation is really the best. I'll bring copies in next week so that we'll use, when we read, we'll use that translation together, because it's a better translation than either of the ones we're using. The one I'm using is the standard Protestant translation. You guys are using the standard Jewish translation, right?
Because it's so much more violent when you say ravaged than when you say captured.
Both, what I'd say about this is when we deal with the NRSV or the JPS, both are toning it down in their way, right? Because the interpretive tradition, and we're going to get to this, I'm sort of leading us in. I want us to just first realize just how earthy and physical and sexual this thing is. That's what this opening set is really about, is for us to really realize just how earthy and physical and sexual this poem is, because it's surprising when we read Bible. We're not thinking that when we read Bible. that's really what this poem is. So that's why I'm having us start reading rather than do some sort of intro. But where I'm going to go with this is where both the Christian and the Jewish tradition go as far as their dominant way to interpret this, which is very different, right? Because you can understand how both rabbis and early priests would be like, what are we going to do with this? Right? We're talking about pubic hair. What are we going to do with this? Right? I mean, this is not for the kids. And it's sitting there in the Bible. We may do some of this later. There's a number of later rabbinic midrashim that are basically, what is this doing in the Bible? The rabbis know their Hebrew is good and they're reading it and they're like, I can't believe this is in the Bible. Right? So maybe we'll get to that. We'll get to that at some point over these lessons. But that really becomes the real question in the religious context, is we have this ancient sexual poem. I won't even say poem of courtship, because courtship's a piece of it, but it really is a sexual poem. It's a poem about sexual attraction and consummation, and it ends up in the Bible, which is just one of the, it's just completely bizarre and wonderful to me. So that this ends up in there, and I think it's so absolutely unlikely that this of all things would end up in there. And by the end of it, you'll have an idea how it got in there by the end, in half an hour or so. Okay? I've been talking a bit. I think was there another comment in there? No. Okay. All right. Good. All right. So your lips distill nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. Again, these are images of luxury. The scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride, right? All female imagery is always sort of interior, locked inside, right? Because that's where women were. Men are out in the fields. A garden locked, a fountain sealed, right? What word do you have there? Because that's another one of these hard to translate words.
The garden is my sister, a hidden well.
In 13, at the beginning.
Your branches are an orchard of pomegranate trees.
Okay, so he's going branches. That's interesting.
Limbs.
Limbs would work. It's something that goes outward straight. All right, that much we know, right, in this particular case. So limbs or branches would probably go best. This has channel, which makes no sense whatsoever in the context, because we're talking about an orchard. So branches or limbs is a better translation.
One of those hapex words.
One of these hapex words, we have no idea what this word actually means. But then they do a comparison to the ancient. It obviously means something that goes out straight, because they're saying channel here. But your channel is somewhat good. In some ways, channel may be a better translation. Why? Because a channel is hollow. You see where I'm going here? Because this is what we're talking about. Your is an orchard of pomegranates with the choicest of fruits, henna and nard. You have a fruitful and fragrant, fruitful and fragrant female pudenda. There we go. Is that well enough?
Can't you just say vagina?
We got it.
Vagina's so medical. As pudenda sort of is too, but it's the Latin, right? It has a little bit of a poetic thing because it's Latin. So, I have a funny story. I took a course in college, an undergraduate. We were reading Joyce's Ulysses, and there's a sexual scene in that, or a sexual reference in that. And the professor was very uncomfortable because he had to find some sort of word for vagina. And he's up there stumbling and trying to get it. He finally says, female pudenda. I thought that was just very funny. That was the best he could do for a euphemism. But anyway, so that's how I learned that word, because I looked it up when I knew what it meant. Oh, the Latin. So that's what we're talking about here in 13, right? So in a way, limbs and branches, although limbs and branches works better with orchard, right? In the sense of straight and narrow. Channel, which is the Protestant translation here, probably, I think, is a better translation poetically, right? since we're talking about a vagina here. Nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, all of these wonderful fragrant spices, and the trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes and chief spices, a garden fountain, a well of living water. I mean, this is one of the most marvelous poems to a vagina that we're going to have in like the 21st century, right?
This should be in the monologue, what did they have?
Yeah, like
Vagina
the vagina
monologues?
monologues, right? Because it's right here, we're in sort of like the ancient vagina monologues.
You actually asked to do this lecture.
I just think this is such a great text to sort of explode what the Bible's about and what the Bible is doing, right? Which is incredibly important in a Reformed Jewish context, right? This is gorgeous ancient Mediterranean literature. Not all the Bible is, all right? P is not, the greatest, he's not a literary giant, although, a religious genius of his sort. The priestly writer, the guy writing about the sacrifices and etc., not a literary giant, right? Very important to subsequent Judaism and Christianity, but not a literary giant. This guy's a literary giant. This is, just gorgeous poetry that would have stood in its day, right? And we're still reading it today. Is incredible. But this is walking the line between the bathroom wall and the high school men's locker room. And I want you guys to get that. He's walking a fine line between that and high art. And sometimes he's easing into the locker room. It's there. And it got into the Bible. I think you guys now see why I chose chapter 4, because it gets my point across the best. We have a male writer, so his description of the female is much more lucid than his description of the male. He doesn't get as excited about, he doesn't even mention the penis, right? That's not what he's concerned about. But, we have this just gorgeous description. And I'm sure that Bloch must mention the sexuality of this. He has to see it. But in any case. The other translator who's also really good is, what is her name? She's a Yiddishist. Marcia Tuffman or Tussman. She also did a translation. She's a Yiddishist. She's not a Semiticist. She did a translation, and that's the one that really captures the sexual side the most explicitly. But like with most poetry, this is very difficult to translate, because if you just translated the sexuality, you're really not doing it, you're not getting at the full thing. Because like most poetry, when you read a poem, there's always 2 or 3 at least things going on at the same time with any good poetic verse, right? That's why it's poetry, not prose. Is that the line does so much more. And this poem as well. So it's in the gutter and in the heavens, really at the same time. And it captures both in the Hebrew. And that's ultimately the literary genius of this particular writer. All right. So I got you guys to laugh, which was really important. I'm going to go over, so any, questions or comments before I move on to the way that this sexuality was interpreted out of existence by the rabbis and also by the church fathers. Do you have anything? I was doing my Kaddish hand. Around. All right. So, thank God for allegory, is what the rabbis said. All right? And I think I may go into this with, so, what is allegory? Allegory essentially, allegory is different than, what's the difference between allegory and metaphor? Right? Go ahead.
Well, an allegory is a story that suggests another theme. A metaphor is comparing, such as using the word like or as.
Yeah, simile and metaphor are sort of similar. Simile is more explicit than metaphor, right? So when we talk about simile, it's when you're actually using the like or as. Metaphor probably doesn't actually have the like or as, but is being evocative about something, expanding a meaning of something without saying like or as, without being so obvious about it. Right? So I'm trying to think of some examples. Like simile would be, there's a ton of them here, right? Here, your eyes are doves. That's metaphor. He's not saying they're like doves. They are doves. And then you can say to yourself, well, how are they doves? So let's run with that. How could eyes be like doves? Color is a possibility, right? Because there's white in there. Shape, exactly. There's a similar shape to a dove's body. The movement of the eyes and the fluttering of the wings, the movement of the eyelids. All right, so we already got 3. We could go on and on and on. But metaphor works like that. Metaphor is generative. It opens up meaning. Right? You create more and more meaning. The better the metaphor, the more stuff you get out of it. Right? When we talk about allegory, although there is a comparison, and that's the place of similarity, or metaphor ultimately is working on comparison, but in a way that expands meaning. Allegory also works on comparison, but it does the exact opposite. It closes down and locks down meaning. It closes down possible interpretations. So in an allegory, you really are saying that this equals that. So an allegory, let's think of an allegory. There's a song, I'll interpret a Merle Haggard song allegorically. There's a song by Merle Haggard called Tonight the Bottle Let Me Down. All right? The bottle isn't what let him down. It's a country western song. Obviously, the bottle didn't let him down. In this particular case, the bottle is drunkenness. He's sad about something, so he got drunk, and his drunkenness did not give him the outcome he desired. As often is the case when we're sad and we put a lot of depressants in our body, right? Not a real smart way to go, right? So in this particular case, the bottle is drunkenness. In a way, he's closing down meaning. If I say the bottle, that can mean a lot of different things, right? There's a lot of possible ways I can interpret the bottle, but he's doing an allegory there where the bottle represents his drunkenness, right? So it's actually closing down meaning. That's allegory, all right? And ultimately, that's what the rabbis use to interpret the sex out of existence in Song of Songs, is allegory. So, we have the man, and we have the woman. The man is, anybody know this? Make a guess? No, the woman's got to be Israel, because of the other one. Yeah, I mean, come on, God's not going to be a woman, are you serious? Right? I mean, they're going to, the men who are making this up are going to imagine God in their own image,
Yeah.
right? So it's interesting. So we're stuck with the woman being Israel, right? As in the people of Israel, not the modern day country, right? So in case you were wondering, this poem is about the love affair between God and the people of Israel. Did you know that?
Yeah, I knew that.
Right. And you see, allegory is this incredibly powerful tool for shutting down meaning. Right? It's funny, when I teach about allegory and everybody comes out like thinking, oh, allegory is bad, I hate allegory, right? No, I mean, it's a very effective way of doing this one thing, right? We tend to like literature that opens up meaning in our contemporary world, right? We want our literature to be evocative. And so allegory isn't that interesting to us now because it's so simple. But it has its purposes. And it very much served a wonderful purpose here of completely eliminating all sexuality. Because clearly, God and the people of Israel are not having sex. Right? So the sex is just gone. It's totally gone. So in one interpretive swoop, the rabbis essentially, we went from the vagina monologues to an edifying religious text about the relationship between God and the Jews. It's a beautiful interpretive move by the rabbis. And now, you can keep the thing in the Bible. Right? Right? So this is, the rabbis getting very heavy-handed interpretation-wise. Now, this also is not, notice I did dotted lines. We're dividing Judaism and Christianity here. So I don't want to have solid lines. The lines are always dotted. So even today they definitely are, right? You know, who here has Christians in their family? A lot of people, right? So in one way or the other, whether it be kids marrying or etc., in-laws, the whole bit. So the church fathers do a similar move, and yeah, I should do something on that. Well, maybe I'll do that, maybe I won't. I'm supposed to be teaching Judaism, so I'll stick to Judaism, all right? But the Christian stuff is pretty interesting. So in Christianity, not surprisingly, the man is, because they have a man, right? So it's got to be Jesus, right, or Christ. And the woman is what their version of Israel, of their sense of peoplehood, is referred to as the church. Not the building, but the concept. The same way that we have this thing, Israel, that is not actually an object, but is really a concept of peoplehood. They have church, which is their concept of peoplehood. I should note in parentheses, Islam has it too. They call it ummah. That's their word for their sense of peoplehood. You can't really have a monotheism without defined boundaries of peoplehood. Sort of, it's how the thing goes. That's another lesson, though. That's created much of the violence of the past, 3,000 years. Is that combination of monotheism with a defined peoplehood. That's another whole lesson. So the church has their own version of this, and the church now can keep it in the Bible too. Because this is about the relationship that the Christian people have with Jesus. All right? The love affair taken as allegory. All right? All right. So there we go. With one fell swoop, it's all gone. All right. All right, so let's see here. I was wondering whether I was going to do this or not, but I decided to do it. Sometimes I like to hand out my notes, because then, why not, right? It's not like it's some huge secret. So these are essentially the notes that I was going to teach this section off of, and then, teachers too often treat teaching like there has to be some sort of surprise ending, and if you give your students where you're going to somewhere in the middle, then they get to spend half the class knowing where it's going. And you learn more when you know where it's going. I tend to give away the end. All right. All right, so I have here and I flipped this around. Instead of doing this as an opening set, we went right into the literature. So I have your traditional Jewish interpretation sees the poem as an allegory of the love affair between God, the man, and the chosen people, Israel, the woman. Then I have my list here. We're going to do a little bit of Midrash Rabbah today to show this. The Targum Shir HaShirim, which is the Aramaic translation of the Bible, the Aramaic translation of this poem, is probably the strongest case for this allegorical reading, and it's a fascinating text. I just, I learned Rabbinic Aramaic by reading this text. This was sort of like my textbook for learning Rabbinic Aramaic. So I have a ton of notes on it, and I haven't looked at it for a decade. So sometime in the next week, I think I'll go back and look at that stuff, and we'll probably do some Targum Shir HaShirim next week, just so that I can give you guys something that really you're not going to get anywhere else. It's an untranslated text, and it hasn't been translated into English, and it's a neat little corner of Judaism. It's so odd that there was some debate as to whether it was actually written by rabbis or not. There's a possibility that it was non-rabbinic Judaism, because it has a very different theology, a very different way of looking at God than the rabbis do. And then again, traditional Christian interpretation sees the poem as an allegory for the love affair between Christ the man and church the woman. And then we have Origen, John Chrysostom, Gregory and Nyssa. Origen is really the classic, because Origen is living in Caesarea in the 4th century. So he's living in Israel. So the rabbis who are creating Midrash Rabbah, a lot of those rabbis are living literally in the same town as Origen, as he's creating his commentary to Song of Songs. So it's one of these cool places where we have a major church father and major rabbinic figures literally in the same town at the same time writing about the same thing, Song of Songs. There's a whole bunch of scholarship that came out about this in the 1970s, and nobody's touched it again. It's really ripe for a revisit. I guess maybe if I'd become an academic, I would have been the revisit, but I didn't. So,
Did they-
serving the Jews.
Did they collaborate at all?
Could I elaborate?
No, did they collaborate?
They did not. I think collaborate is too strong of a word. The question is, how much were they aware of what each other were doing? And I think that's an open question. Look at this. How much aware are they? I don't see how they couldn't be aware of what each other are doing. They're using the exact same mode of interpretation.
But there's a timing issue. I mean, wasn't the Jewish perspective done?
No, it's the exact same time. Because we have to remember, just because the Bible's around doesn't mean Judaism's around. The Bible predates Judaism, right? And I'm sorry, you hit one of my buttons, so I got off.
No, you're yours.
Right? So there's, so ultimately, both the church, we have this church father and rabbi sitting in the same time and place, both trying to go after the same question. What am I going to do with this sex poem sitting in the Bible? So it's a really interesting moment for a comparison between the two religions. And Origen wrote a whole commentary to the Song of Songs, which my Greek was not good enough to read when my Greek was at its best. His Greek's really good. And my Greek is far from its best at this point again. So, it's sort of an interesting moment in time. I don't think we're going to get into that comparison. That was that moment I had over there where what I decided not to do. So I'm going to tell you what we decided not to do, but I think it's important to note that. This is a place where Judaism and Christianity were sort of playing on the same playground in the 4th century.
What does BT stand for?
Babylonian Talmud. Okay. They're my notes to myself, so I had my abbreviation. All right. So then I have these other sort of bullet points here. There have been a number of different theories about what is actually going on in this poem. This also is taken a mystical direction. So I have this as the first one. So if this is about the relationship between God and Israel, there's this whole thread of Kabbalah which talks about the relationship between God and Israel in sexualized, and the people, God and the Jews in sexualized language. And to a large degree it builds upon this allegory, but it brings the sex back in. So it keeps the allegory, then brings the sex back in and talks about a mystical love between God and the people of Israel. So in the Jewish tradition, that's one direction where things go, is bringing the sex back in, but having it be a spiritualized sexuality. All right? So it's using sexual imagery, but obviously the way that, in the sense that the mystic wants to experience divine, wants union with the divine, wants to be one with the divine, and what in human experience comes closer than oneness than good sex? When sex with love, right? So the mystics pick up on that and develop that interpretive thread. We're not going to go there, but that is one possibility. The dramatic theory. I alluded to one of those, right? I talked about the chorus voice. So there are some scholars, of the ancient Near Eastern biblical scholars, who think that essentially this thing was performed, right? That there would be three parts. There'd be a woman and a man and a chorus, and it actually was sort of like an ancient play, and it was performed, right? So dramatic theory, and I think that's coming out of overreading the chorus. Just because there's a chorus doesn't mean there's a play, right? I actually don't think that one's right, but I want to bring these up, different ways this has been interpreted. Freehoff, Samuel Freehoff, famous Reform rabbi. Anybody heard of him? Good. So, he was at the one in it's in Pittsburgh, isn't it? Anyways, he was one of the great scholars of Reform Judaism in the first half of the 20th century. He was, one of these guys who could sit down with the Orthodox guys and go head to head on rabbinic texts. Really powerful reader of rabbinic text, functioning within the Reform movement. And he also wrote an article about Song of Songs that was very influenced by the ideas of Sigmund Freud. And he said, it's all a dream. That's what's going on here. I don't think that there's any way that could be right. Now that we're a bit distant from Freud's theories, love Freud, absolute genius. The only Jew in his era who was smarter than him was Marx. So those two guys, just the most influential, just such incredible minds. Marx gets such a bad rap because of communism. The guy's such a genius, and his thoughts incredible. Really worthwhile to read Marx. Get the Marxist reader and read a little bit of Marx. The stuff is just so brilliant and incredible. Just because of what happened, essentially, just because Soviet communism was so evil doesn't mean that Marx was. Marx would have been disgusted with Soviet communism in any case. But I digress. I always feel like anytime I have a group, I got to defend my man Marx. All right. So that was one idea, that essentially this is all a dream. I think that's also Freehoff being a bit of a Victorian. He's uncomfortable with the sexuality, so being physical, so he has to turn it into a dream. He does sort of a Freudian version of what the rabbis do. So I'll do a psychological reading of him, which he sort of asked for by bringing Freud in. Wedding song theory. It's the idea that this comes out of a genre of ancient literature, where at weddings, there'd be musicians who would sing these sexy songs. I actually like this idea, whether it's true or not, who knows, but it's a neat idea. Right, because, you would, sort of sing these songs that had sexual allusions and were a bit sexually evocative at the wedding night. It's sort of the equivalent of the drunk friend of the groom who makes an inappropriate toast, right? This is, these wedding songs, which would be a bit teasing and evocative of the sexuality that was about to happen, right? So that's one idea. This one I think is less likely. It's the idea that this comes out of ancient Near Eastern Semitic fertility cult literature. And then it's basically adapted by the Israelites as a genre and essentially turned into this poem. I guess it's a possibility. We definitely know that in ancient Israel there was a fertility cult. We know who the fertility goddess was named. She shows up in the Bible. Her name's Asherah. You ever heard of her? Right? She's known a lot more by her Northwest Semitic name Ishtar. Right? So there was a version of Ishtar which was very popular in ancient Israel. We know that because the guys who wrote the Bible spend a lot of time saying, don't worship Asherah, so we know that therefore she was being worshipped. What else do we know? We know that her worship sites were trees. You set up an altar in front of a tree when you worshipped Asherah. There is an inscription that was found in the north of Israel that talked about Yahweh and his concubine Asherah. So we know that there were a segment of Israelites who believed that Yahweh had a lover who was named Asherah. This is all like the stuff that the editors of the Bible tried to write out, essentially, that was a part of ancient Israelite worship, the sort of female divine side of things. So it's the idea that there was this sort of female fertility cult going on in ancient Israel, and this literature is coming out of that. Who knows? I mean, I feel confident that there was a female fertility cult in ancient Israel that got knocked out later on with a more male-dominated religion. But whether this literature came from it, who knows? The other is the way that I essentially just read a version of it. It's a humanistic poem. It isn't about God at all. Any more than just humans or than anything is about God. Right? I mean, where's God mentioned? In the chapter that we read. Where's God mentioned in the whole book? Nowhere. It's not about God. It's about human love. And that's the tack that I took at the beginning. And essentially by talking about allegory and metaphor and simile, we're looking at ancient love literature. And this is ultimately, I think, a humanistic poem that, because it was part of ancient Israelite literature and it survived for some reason, ends up in the Bible. So we have to turn it into something religious. But it's no more religious than life. I mean, you have to realize, in my approach to Judaism, I'm ultimately closest to the Hasidim in my regular life, in the sense that the major observation of Hasidut, of Hasidic Judaism, is that the place to be religious is this world and everyday life. That's Hasidism in a couple of sentences, right? It's not some big, grand spiritual thing. Hasidism is that I said the proper bracha before I drank my tea, thereby making this a sanctified event. It's regular human, this worldly activity is really where religion is, right? This whole thing that we do in Reform Judaism, where we turn religion into something that we do for an hour and schmooze afterwards on Friday night. It's just an atrocity to the Hasidim. And all the more so, they'd say the thing you're doing after services is as important or more important than services. The fact that you're having food with other Jews, this is the possibility of a holy occasion, right? Prayer's just getting you there. It's the vehicle, right? So when I say that it's humanistic, I'm not saying God isn't in it. I don't mean in the sense of humanism, right? But ultimately, I guess I'm getting to my conclusion. I always do that. I think that some of the real value of this text is it's showing us that the most human of things, sexuality, has godliness in it, right? And has religiosity in it. That's really where everyday life is. So I'm doing an interpretation. I don't know if that's necessarily what this writer was doing. I actually think this writer actually was pretty much a humanist. He's not thinking about God. He's thinking about sex. I guess I'm trying to put the God back in, being a rabbi and all that. Okay? All right, so let's, so you had all these interpretations. Does anybody else have any other ideas about how to read this or any comments on all this? I just gave a bunch of information.
You hit home with me, Rabbi. You spoke to me on this basis. Having had a conversation with Rabbi Weil after I attended his 3-hour Shabbat morning bat mitzvah service, and I went up to him and I just said one word, why? He looked at me and smiled. He said, that's how they want it, or I'm undergoing negotiating with Rabbi Neil brief about modernizing our service. My contention is the shorter the service, like Reform Judaism preaches, the shorter the service, the better, so people can have community, and they can schmooze, and they can visit, and they can talk, and they can interact afterward, and not being totally wiped out by all these hours of davening.
I agree. Give them an experience and get out.
Yeah.
Have that experience be good and powerful. But man, if you're not hitting it 10 or 15 minutes in, you're not doing your job.
And repeating prayers over and over and over again, for what?
Reform Judaism has turned the Friday night service into an atrocity.
Well, I don't believe in that. I don't believe that.
I mean, in the sense that you're talking about.
Have you been to
I'm
ours?
overstating, right, to make my point, which is something that's fun to do. In this sense, if you go to a traditional Jewish service, you know how long Ma'ariv is on Friday night?
Too long.
20 minutes tops.
Is that traditional?
Yeah. And then Reform Judaism, because this is our main service and we're operating on this Protestant model and we started things off, services have to be at least an hour in the Protestant setting, right? So we take this 15 or 20 minute service and we just stretch it out with all this, you know.
But it makes it appealing to the congregation, and they do get from it. They do get
It's
from
tough.
it.
I mean, there's a balance that's there. You know, I think that, you know, you can run the risk in that 15 to 20 minute Ma'ariv where you're just tearing through the thing and there's no meaning to it, right? So I'm not disagreeing with that, that often in the Orthodox setting it really can go the other direction. But I think that Reform Judaism at some point went the other way. I grew up with Harold Kudan at Am Shalom. At the time, they were not affiliated with the Reform movement, so we used our own prayer book. We were out of there 40, 45 minutes. It was beautiful, right? And it's great for the kids. We digress, but this is a good digression.
Thank you.
Well, you touch on something that I'm really recently very in touch with. We have a son who lives in Cambodia, and he has somehow connected with the Lubavitcher rabbi.
Yeah.
And we went to Shabbat services, 35 minutes. They had 20 men for minyan. There were some women sitting in the back.
Right. Or in this.
But it was 30 minutes. I could follow, I was surprised how much of the service I could pick out, followed by a Shabbat dinner of 45 people, and they come.
Yeah.
And people come because this man has made that connection.
Yep. You know, that connection is so important, and the people make the connection with each other. You know, Chabad's way ahead of us in a lot of things, and we need to learn certain things from them. I'm not, you know, I don't like obviously the way they do gender. I don't like the way that they deal with the LGBTQ community, right? But some real basics they really have down that we could learn from.
Yeah.
And also just how open and warm and welcoming they are.
They are.
Whether Jew or non-Jew.
Yes. Believe me, I do not have a son who is really connected and grounded. But he has him coming to many things.
And we should also realize that most people like your son who have an experience with Chabad, it's just for a period of time.
Yeah.
And then they come back into the non-Orthodox world having been enlivened by the possibilities of Judaism. So in that way, Chabad can be an incredible partner with Reform Judaism. We tend to be down on, you know what percentage of Reform Jews end up becoming Orthodox? Less than 1%. Don't worry about your kids, okay? They're not going to become Chabadniks, relax. It's statistically incredibly unlikely, okay? And everybody gets all nervous about that because they're such proselytizers. It doesn't work. but they do give them these powerful experiences for a period of time. Your son's eventually going to end up back in America, and now he's going to have this thing in his head that Judaism is something that can be important to his life. So thank you, Chabad. Let's give him the credit.
I think the reason the rabbis love to say is sexuality is beautiful, it's necessary, and in that respect it connects it with God, because God created us and we create our children. My only little thing about this, is there anywhere in here where it says that you're going to have my beautiful children for the woman?
No, because this is young love. They're not thinking about kids.
Oh, okay.
Right? Right? I mean, I got married a little later in life. My wife was, 35 when we got married, so it was like, let's get down to business. I had approximately 10 and a half months between my wedding day and a kid arriving, right? So I missed that part of marriage, which is this part of marriage. I also had a relatively short courtship because I was an older man. I met the woman I loved. I got, let's do this thing, right? When you're an older person, you can just get down to business. Yeah. It was there, come on.
You can make it romantic.
I actually think that being businesslike about these things is actually positive to some degree. Anybody who has kids in their 20s who aren't married can maybe empathize with me a little bit if you're thinking grandchildren. But I guess what I'm getting at that, there's this beautiful moment in a relationship that's the courtship and before kids arrive, where there's something really special, right? And once kids are there, the relationship's very different. And this is in that mode before kids, right? Where there's a sort of heightened aspect to the relationship. It's not about anybody else. But very quickly, once the kids are there, as it should be, it's about them, to a large degree. And then if your marriage lasts, you get another chance, right? I'm not there yet. 7 more years.
Would it be fair to say that at the very end of, say, chapter 4 is a kind of climactic moment, to speak metaphorically?
Yes, I think that it is fair to say that when we are awaking the north wind, this is what's going on. I felt like I'd gone far enough with the vagina description, so I didn't keep rolling. But you are right on target as far as my interpretation, right? Yes. There is sexual contact at the end of chapter 4. So I think that that's fair to say. You're absolutely right.
Are we going to study the part, I am my beloved is mine? I've
Maybe,
sung that at weddings.
Ultimately, that's the most used piece, right?
I've sung it at weddings in beautiful settings.
Right, and so that's obviously used in a lot of contemporary weddings, and that's really where Song of Songs show up. As the Jewish wedding becomes more and more Protestant, in other words, as there's more and more talking up front. The Jewish wedding is about 7 minutes long, and there's no real talking. There's a few sentences exchanged. You read the ketubah, a few more sentences, break the glass, boom. That's it. And I'm sure that wasn't your guys' weddings and isn't the weddings that you've gone to. In Reform Judaism, we Protestantized the wedding so much by having all this talking in English up front, which is nice. I mean, it gets the mood going a little bit, so when you get down to the ritual, it's not so businesslike. But one of the ways that we've Protestantized the Jewish wedding is by having readings from Song of Songs in the opening readings, or having someone who's a cantor or a cantorial soloist singing something from Song of Songs at the beginning of the wedding. So this has begun to play a role. It also is often written on ketubot, etc. Right? This is what we have. So, all right. So ultimately, I guess I could dig into this rabbinic allegory, this rabbinic text from Song of Songs, but I feel like you guys sort of get it, and we're getting a little bit antsy here. Well, flip the page. Flip your page. You have a surprise text there. This is from Midrash Rabbah. Commentary to 4.5. All right? So, just in case you think you're talking about breasts. All right? These are Moses, and the breasts are not breasts. They're Moses and Aaron, of course. Right? Just as the breasts are the beauty and ornament of a woman, so Moses and Aaron are the ornament and beauty of the people of Israel. Just as the breasts are the charm of a woman, so Moses and Aaron are the charm of Israel. Just as the breasts are the glory and pride of a woman, so Moses and Aaron are the glory and pride of Israel. Just as the breasts are full of milk, so Moses and Aaron filled Israel with Torah. Just as whatever a woman eats helps to feed the child at the breast, so all the Torah that Moses our master learned, he taught to Aaron. As is written in Scripture, and Moses told Aaron all the words of the Lord. All right, so this is a way of showing you in a very concrete way the way that this sexuality was interpreted out of existence. Now, all of a sudden, instead of the breasts are not breasts, but the breasts are Moses and Aaron. The milk that comes out of the breast is Torah, feeding Israel, just as Moses and Aaron transmitted Torah, and we have a very different meaning to this text. All right. So next week we'll do a little bit of Targum Shir HaShirim. We'll do a little bit of this Aramaic translation on the Song of Songs. I mean, what I hope that we can take out here as the closing piece is this. I guess we got it over there. Is that the way that sexuality, in one way, is an exemplum of everything that is the most physical about being human and everything that is the most emotional and spiritual about being human. We can take that as a very powerful way to think about religiosity, a very powerful way to think about our relationship with God. That it is this multi-dimensional, rich thing. And by, ultimately, whether that was the intention or not of the people who put this in here, by having this highly sexual poem sitting here in Song of Songs, we have essentially this contemporary resource to really sort of think through about how to go about that in everyday life. So that's my closer, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you. Toda Rabbi.